Hi again, Professor Kellen Honkrum once again. Welcome to session 2. This week we're going to be talking about fiction. There are 3 major genres that we'll be talking about. There's 4 genres in literature, but we'll be looking at 3. The 3 that we'll be looking at are poetry, fiction, and drama. Poetry being those things which rhyme or set in specific structure. We'll get to that in a little while. Fiction, you're well familiar with: short stories, novels, things like that. And then drama, theater. Incidentally, the fourth genre of literature is nonfiction, or in cases of creative nonfiction, which is something that you get in a lot of other courses, so we just don't have time to tackle it in this course. But it is an interesting area. Fiction. Well, something that we all, I think, know from high school and even earlier, that fiction is those works which are not true. Those items that are presented to us, that we as readers understand to not be true. Of course, the inverse is nonfiction, which is things that are true, or sort of kind of true. These days, people buy a lot of nonfiction. If you go into your Barnes & Noble, Barnes & Noble is a large portion of nonfiction books, self-help, recipe books, psychology books, how to start your own business, things like that. So your fiction sections are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and so that seems to be the way that popular book market is going. This is Pete, by the way. Pete is apparently going to continue to ruin our lectures through his outcries and protestations he once loved, and so I thought I'd introduce you. The term genre is important in modern fiction in that we tend, as consumers of literature, and that which is not literature, to buy our books and short stories through genre. Mostly, correctly, through subgenre. We may like science fiction books, romance books, occult romance books, teen, young adult, thriller, horror. These are subgenres, which we'll learn about later on as we go through. But if you were to go into Barnes & Noble, that's how the categories are set for us. So genre, in many cases, is the larger term meaning poetry, drama, fiction, and subgenres being the smaller terms of the areas such as horror or science fiction. Usually stories that we can then predict by plot or setting. A science fiction or a western is set in a specific time period, so we know that the genre is based on setting. Or a thriller, we know that it'll be chases, it'll be action, there'll be a lot of mayhem and fun. James Patterson will probably be involved in some way. And so we understand that that plot is part of the subgenre. Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver's Cathedral is a reading that we're engaging with this week. And Cathedral is an interesting short story. It's one that's often read early on in a literature class such as this. And frankly, the only reason that I chose to read it is that the book that we're using for this course does a great deal of work analyzing it and then providing essays showing that analysis in an essay format. So we're reading Carver essentially so that we can then look at the essays at the end of this chapter and see how those essays are put together. Having said that, Raymond Carver's book has a very simple plot. It is told in first-person narrative. That means that the book is told from one person's point of view, the author's point of view. And the author is a man who has a wife. His wife has a friend who happens to be blind. The blind friend is coming over for a visit, seems to be staying a few days, and our narrator is trepidatious about this, and that's the setup. The man comes, they eat too much food, they drink, they smoke a little pot, And then the wife falls asleep, and the narrator begins to develop a relationship with the man until at the point where they talk about blindness and what blindness is about. And at the end of the story, we find the narrator and his guest, the blind man, drawing pictures of cathedrals. And like many things in literature, it's supposed to be simple. The plot is supposed to be simple, but what does it mean? What does it mean? And as we talked about last session, it can mean anything. It can mean anything to you. And we'll be talking about that next session, how to analyze these things. But very often, the themes are as big as they get. Literature, about the biggest questions we have. Why are we here? Is there a God? What happens after our death? What should we be doing with our time? These are the themes that literature almost always goes to. I always say to my students, if you fall asleep in class and you wake up with me standing over you saying, well, what's the theme of the piece we just read? You can always say death and get away with it, because death is an inevitability in human existence, and therefore it's a theme in every day of our life and every piece of literature. So looking at Raymond Carver and looking at Raymond Carver's Cathedral, we can see early on that the narrator has a great deal of anxiety, trepidation, anger, annoyance about the visitor. We find that the narrator's wife seems to have had an intimate relationship with the blind man. Now, I don't mean a sexual relationship, I mean an intimate relationship. They share things that she does not share with her husband. She sends tapes to him. She talks about her husband to the blind man. And so there's a level of intimacy that the husband cannot achieve. The implication of Carver's narrator is that he's sort of a guy's guy, not too in touch with his feelings, and therefore not the easiest guy in the world to communicate with. At least that's what I pick up in my reading. And so the fact that his wife needs to reach out for her, she has a need that the husband can't meet. That is a need for communication, and that this visitor, this blind man, has filled that need is in my reading a cause of jealousy for our narrator, a cause of annoyance, and a difficult issue. Now, of course, if we look at Carver and we look at gender, which we'll talk about next week, we talk often about gender in this class, by the way, and what gender expectations are. It's really difficult in this case. The blindness of the visitor leaves our narrator in a difficult point. He can't pick a fight with the blind man. That wouldn't be masculine. You can't punch a blind guy, can you? No, you can't. That's the answer. I'm a professor. I know these things. And so it puts our narrator in another situation in that he's got to deal with the man with disability and deal with him on a level that he may feel is not appropriate for men. He can't just be angry or confrontational or aggressive. And so we see as the visit occurs and the man comes along that the wife is very nervous about her husband's behavior, and the husband is trying to be on his best behavior. And eventually, when the wife falls asleep, they fall into a conversation, the narrator and the blind man, about the nature of understanding and the nature of blindness. And at the end of the discussion, they are watching a television show about cathedrals, and the narrator wants to know if the blind man can conceptualize what a cathedral is. And so the blind man says not really. And so they begin drawing in an attempt to further the understanding of the blind man towards what they're dealing with a cathedral. But at the very end, all of the conversation and all of the narrator's discussions about how much he's learning, although he doesn't tell us what he's learning, he implies he's learning a lot. He doesn't tell us what it is. Because guess what? It's our job to figure out what it is. What are the clues to find out what it is? Well, it's a cathedral. Not a Denny's. It's not a school. It's a cathedral. A cathedral gateway to God. Clearly, The idea of a blind person trying to understand what a cathedral is has to be in some way discussing how limited we are as human beings trying to understand the nature of God. The symbolism to me seems correct. Now remember, as we talked about last session, all of literature is subjective. My opinion is not the exclusive and proper opinion. Your opinion may be entirely different. That makes it no less valuable or no less correct. But they pay me to talk about stuff we read, so yeah. Cathedral and a blind man trying to understand what a house of worship is, a house where God is. And then a man helping him, drawing, learning how to get in touch with these things. Well, it seems like Carver here is talking about the nature of life, and it could be what we call an allegory, a story with a second or third or fourth implied meaning. And the allegory here is that maybe we're all the blind man. We're all trying to understand the nature of the divine, the nature of God, and we can't. Or maybe we're all the narrator, unaccepting because of our own emotional issues, our own emotional confinement, our own emotional immaturity. And that when we finally do break through our own barriers, we become more and more capable of coming closer to God or each other. I don't know. Or it's just a story. Read it. Think about it. Make an argument. That's what we do. We read a story. We say this is what the story is about. And then we make the argument as best we can. I hope you have a good session. And I will see you very soon.